Good afternoon, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to our rendition of the Sunday webinar on behalf of the Baldwin Wallace MBA Students Association. Today's topic is the art of compassionate parenting. So I want to take a moment right at the beginning to thank each one of you profusely and profoundly from the depth of my heart for finding time and making time to be present with us in exploring the art of compassionate parenting. The first thing we need to do is to remind ourselves of the complexity, the level of complexity and challenge that we are facing right now in terms of uncertainty, in terms of volatility, in terms of chaos, ambiguity. And our children, we are trying to raise for a future that we absolutely have no understanding of what the world will be. We don't even know what the world will be like 4 weeks from now, 5 weeks from now, with everything that is happening. So to be able to raise children, to be able to cope with and be resilient in a world of such extreme uncertainty as they might encounter appears truly daunting. One thing that we should probably recognize is that none of us have the answers. The challenge is so profound and profound that it's really hard for us to have a prescription on what or how we should be parenting. But it's important for us to recognize that many of us have fallen into certain habits of parenting that appeared particularly well suited for a very stable and predictable world. And we might tend to cling to that, and we may need to question and develop new, more resilient and original responses. For example, look at our own educational system that emphasizes the level of standardization that it emphasizes. Most of our schools and our educational systems are modeled on the image or the metaphor of a factory. You know, there's an input, there's a core transformation process, there's an output. Whereas, although we might be creating standardized learning environments, we can all see that the future holds such uncertainty that what we need to be cultivating in our young people is not the ability to respond in a mechanistic or formulaic manner, as might be acquired through a standardized system, but more the ability to be creative, to be generative and original in responding to situations that we cannot even anticipate. Secondly, often many of us have valued compliance and obedience. We try to train children to be obedient. And that kind of orientation towards fostering obedience will often have an unfortunate side effect of creating people who are docile, who are very good at following instructions, whereas what the times require is actually the ability to be rebellious and defiant, perhaps in creative ways, to be able to reject the time-tested solutions and to chart one's own path. So we need to support children, in other words, in a variety of ways that perhaps our habits of raising children in the past did not support. Think about how much emphasis we place on being structured, planned, and organized. You know, we want children to be very structured and organized, but if you really look at the nature of the challenges that they might encounter in the years ahead, it would actually call for more of an ability to dance with chaos, to be resilient in the face of boundless uncertainty. So the first thing we need to do is to have enormous compassion for our children, enormous compassion, because the level of social, emotional, economic, psychological, spiritual challenge that our children are having to deal with in today's world is mind-boggling. So let us begin with a place of compassion. Now, parenting. We're going to talk about compassionate parenting. And as many of you who've been on these webinars know, this webinar is not something that provides a solution to a problem. We just present perspectives and explore different perspectives, sometimes a few perspectives that may take us a little beyond our usual way of framing situations and thinking about them. So there are a couple of books that have inspired me enormously in this, and I want to give credit to The Book of Children by Osho, O-S-H-O, The Book of Children by Osho. It's a phenomenal book in being able to understand the deeper world of children with a level of emotional sensitivity that honors their sacredness. The Book of Children by Osho. The other book that I would strongly recommend is by Shefali Sabari, a New York-based therapist who has written a book called Conscious Parenting. or The Conscious Parent. The name of the book is The Conscious Parent. Oprah Winfrey has been very enthusiastic about Shefali Sabari's work. You'll find a number of YouTube videos and her book, The Conscious Parent. I would recommend you to those. And I quote them as primary sources of inspiration for today's webinar. So parenting can be seen as a beautiful spiritual partnership. Now, it is interesting, if we look upon parenting as a spiritual partnership, it frames it in a completely different space. It's an opportunity for the parent and the child to grow spiritually. It's not about raising children who obey you, who conform to your image. It is recognizing that parenting can be a very complex process, and every day we will have challenges that will stretch us beyond our comfort zone. And part of enjoying this journey of parenting is to approach it as a spiritual partnership. And that's a framing that can help any of our relationships, even our romantic relationships. When we think of, sometimes we say, I want to be in a romantic relationship, so I'm happy. But you know that any relationship, let alone a romantic relationship, is going to have tremendous ups and downs. So if our focus is on being happy, we are going to feel like we have been put through the ringer. On the other hand, if we have a deeper commitment as a spiritual partnership, we recognize that whatever emerges in the context of that relationship is something that can only deepen and enrich us if we orient towards it with that level of receptivity as a space of growth and a space of learning. So how about we take on parenting, not as getting our children to march to the beat of our drum, but more as a spiritual partnership, perhaps even as a dance. And I like the metaphor of dancing with your children as a metaphor because it implies movement. It does not imply a static relationship, but something that's like a river, constantly moving and flowing in different directions. I also want us to recognize that we have both been parented and are in parenting relationships. And even if you're not a biological parent, there might be many relationships where we are actually in a caregiving role. So I would hope that some of these observations would apply not just to parenting relationships in a narrow sense, but to any kind of a caregiving relationship. As far as parenting relationships are concerned, well, one of the things we have to deal with is think about our own lives. No matter how much our external world may change, the pain of our childhood lingers in our heart. It is something that gives us pause. Our external world may change and it may go through so many detours, but the pain of our childhood is something that we carry all the time. And patterns, some of them that are dysfunctional and may be self-defeating, are actually transmitted in families. In fact, somebody used to say, show me your great-grandparents. And if you tell me a little about your great-grandparents and how they were, I can predict what your grandchildren will be dealing with. Why do we say that? Because some of the emotional and psychological challenges that we encounter in our lives tend to be passed on, almost like a hereditary transmission of, physical illnesses we know through genetics, but this is almost like the hereditary transmission of spiritual and emotional patterns, through generations. And therefore, it is an opportunity for each of us at any time to become more conscious, more aware of how we are relating to our children, and in what ways is that so similar to how our parents related to us. And that gives us an opportunity to be able to change something, to be able to transform something if we so desire. Another basic point is about how we orient to our children. Often, with the busyness of life and the multitude of responsibilities that we have, unconsciously we fall into a place of approaching our children as if they're problems to be solved. Now think about it. If your child is a problem to be solved, then at every turn, we will find more and more problems that need fixing. In fact, we will be following them with a proverbial hammer, to see the nail that needs pounding. An alternative way to orient towards our children is to embrace them as a mystery to be discovered. Imagine if we approach our children as a mystery to be discovered, it creates a much vaster field of possibility. I want to break down my presentation to 3 or 4 themes. The first theme I want to deal with, I call inner housekeeping. What do I mean by inner housekeeping? It's the housekeeping that we as parents need to do in order to be able to relate to children and raise children, with a level of compassion, children who feel understood, children who feel accepted. And one of the first things for us to be aware of is the difference between parenting for perfection versus parenting for totality. When we are parenting for perfection, we are trying to create children, perhaps in our own image, perhaps in our own image, who are perfect, who are without any faults, who are without any mistakes. When we are parenting for totality, we are creating a child who's capable of accepting himself or herself fully. Now, how can we do that? There is no formula for it, but the first step is to embrace our perfectly flawed selves. We are perfectly imperfect. Each one of us is. None of us have it right. We are fumbling. And to be able to embrace our perfectly flawed self, if we develop a sense of humor towards our own limitations and our flaws, it's the best gift we can give our children in terms of creating a space for error, a space for experimentation, and a space for playfulness. Self-awareness among parents is perhaps very important for us to at least try to resolve our own issues, because sooner or later, in relating to our children, the remnants of our own emotional past are bound to become re-excavated. It's going to come back. Our own childhoods will show up, in the childhoods of our children, as Shafali Sabari has pointed out. And our children are experiencing from us an energy field. And that energy field is either one of acceptance or of rejection. And sometimes we are not aware of that, because this energy field is something that we have often received from our parents. Our parents either condemned us and rejected us, and then, or they accepted us. And from imbibing and introjecting that energy field, we will be transferring this imprint to our parents. So first thing, the housekeeping to become aware of what's the energy field I am generating. For example, some of us are generating the energy field of the critical parent. We're very critical and judgmental towards our children, and perhaps we're very critical and judgmental towards ourselves. Now, a child who's parented in a critical parent energy field will experience a different reality from one who's parented in a nurturing parent energy field. The nurturing parent is more kinder, gentler, more accepting. So for us to be aware of what is the energy field that we would be generating. Another major recommendation from Osho, which appears scary, is this. One of the greatest gifts we can give our children is to release our children from the need for our approval and disapproval. Now that seems hard, because isn't it through our approval and approval that we learn to control and shape our children's lives? Yes, but it's a double-edged sword. Children who are at the mercy of your approval and disapproval slowly outsource their capabilities, their approach to life, to something outside themselves. Why do we find so much peer conformity, people conforming to sources outside? Because we have made acceptance very conditional. In fact, we treat our children, says Osho, no different than circus animals. What do we mean by that? Like, we try to train them to be compliant. We reward them for compliant behavior. We accept them and we reject them when they are not compliant. Now, from talking to many people, I have come to discover that one of the greatest sources of pain that a human being often carries is the fear or the feeling they have that they have disappointed their parents. It's just amazing how much of a toll this feeling that you have disappointed your parents takes on children. And therefore, one of the easiest ways to be able to absolve children of this great burden is to release them from expectations, to love them unconditionally for who they are and who they are not, and to have to understand that your expectations may be there, and sometimes these expectations have been passed on in families and they get transmitted through the challenges that we have faced. In fact, Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, talks about a concept which we often touch about in this webinar called the Panoptic Gaze, that our caregivers looked at us with certain hopes and with certain fears. And those hopes and fears have gotten deeply entrenched within us. And those hopes and fears often prevent us from experiencing life fully. They also prevent us from seeing our children for who they are. I told you, I think in one of the previous seminars, of a neurosurgeon who got up and stood up in one of my seminars and said, "Oh my goodness, I see how I've been so unhappy all my years, despite a very successful career as a neurosurgeon, because my dad wanted me to be a professor and I became a doctor. And I carry a deep sense of failure. And I'm constantly thinking it's not enough that I'm a neurosurgeon. I should be teaching neurosurgery somewhere." The burden of this expectation, this hope, and I know somebody else who's doing their PhD, although they're a nurse and they enjoy nursing, but they're carrying this burden of getting their PhD because it was an expectation from the grandparents. So to be aware of the ways in which we ourselves are carrying panoptic gazes. Panoptic gazes are the hopes and fears of people who have loved us that are being projected into us, and that we in turn project to other people as well. So often, our way of showing love towards our children is to be worrying about them, and that appears somewhat tragic. Think about it. If you're a child, would you want to be remembered as somebody who brought great joy to your parents? Or do you want to be remembered as somebody who was the cause of all their worries and anxieties? So one of the things that we don't do often enough is to share with our children what a great source of joy they are. Too often we focus on telling them how worried I have been about you, as if that worry is going to help them better appreciate the love that you have for them. What it helps them do is it creates a mental model as love is equal to worry and worry is equal to love. And often too many families, worrying about other people has become the way of showing love, instead of actually letting people know what a source of joy and happiness they have been to us. Another trap that we have fallen into as a result of developments in modern psychology that we have to be careful about is that we have become too focused on children's behavior. How is my child behaving? That's a surface level issue. We need to be more interested in the inner life of our children, to love the inner life of our children, to be curious about the inner life of our children. And too often, we have lost that sense of curiosity in the inner life of our children, and our relationship to them has become one of worrying about them or controlling them or making sure they follow our wishes and expectations for them. I also want to introduce what's called the Theory Y and Theory X children of parenting that comes from Douglas McGregor's writings on management. So Theory X supervisors or parents, whether they're, and here's where how we often relate to people at work is a reflection of how we have been related to as children. Theory X supervisors or Theory X parents don't trust children or the people they supervise. So if you're inherently distrustful of children and you believe that they have to be carefully monitored, they have to be carefully supervised, otherwise they will goof off. Children are inherently irresponsible. If we have a view of children as inherently irresponsible, we are following the Theory X. On the other hand, Theory Y parents are people who believe that children are gravitating, imperceptibly towards a process of self-realization and self-actualization. And our role in their life is one of being their spiritual partners, allowing them to make their mistakes and loving them unconditionally. And if we are able to allow children to make their mistakes, love them unconditionally, and be a spiritual partner in the flowering of their potential and trust them. The trust is so important because, as you know, with the psychology research on the self-fulfilling prophecy, if you consider your children as irresponsible, they will live up to your image of being irresponsible. Because in one way or the other, children are very sensitively attuned and they pick up the unconscious expectations that you have of them. So if I see my child as irresponsible and lazy, he or she will make himself irresponsible and lazy because he's reacting to those assumptions, to the impressions that you have about them. And therefore, to be conscious of how we have been parented, because if we were parented in a way that made us feel we were lazy and irresponsible, we are likely to replicate that. In terms of replicating our childhood patterns, I also want to take a moment to talk about a book called Addiction to Unhappiness, Addicted to Unhappiness, written by Martha and Bill Piper. And this book is an interesting book because it talks about how some of the emotional situations that you encountered in your childhood the emotional environment that surrounded you in your childhood is something that you will tend to perpetuate and recreate, not just with your children, but in all your relationships. And the example that I give from my own life is how in my life, in my family, there was a tremendous amount of conflict. And I had become addicted to conflict. So I would always go and start conflict everywhere, because if there was conflict around me and people were screaming with each other, it made me feel more comfortable. So in so many ways, my unconscious mind will create conflict because in some ways it has become addicted to it. It seems familiar and comforting. But on the other hand, if there's a great degree of peace and happiness and celebration, somehow it feels different from my childhood. So it feels unfamiliar. And when it feels unfamiliar, it feels uncomfortable. So let us all be aware to take some time to understand what are these patterns from childhood that we may have absorbed unconsciously, because we will be recreating those patterns. We become addicted to the same emotion. Sometimes it's conflict, sometimes it's possessiveness, sometimes it's jealousy, sometimes it's anger, sometimes it's disappointment, sometimes it's hopelessness. So if there are some leftover remnant emotions, we tend to perpetuate them so much in our relationships. So self-awareness on our part is so important. So what is our role as parents? Osho would perhaps say, to help the child love itself more. For many mystics like Osho, one of the fundamental breakdowns that has happened in life is that people's relationships with themselves has been broken. From the ways that we have parented, many of us have come to hate ourselves because we know that our parents have standards and ideals and we fall short of that. What does that do? We feel very disappointed with ourselves. So a part of us does not want to disappoint our parents, so we start hating ourselves. And this self-hate permeates so much of our life and our relationships. And to Osho, if we can create an environment where we can accept ourselves fully, we will be able to raise children who can accept themselves unconditionally. And if children can accept themselves unconditionally with all their strengths and all those their limitations, that causes an inner revolution of acceptance, of love, of gratefulness, and all of that changes completely. So helping children love themselves more fully, seeing children as little people rather than as immature entities. Too often we fall into the trap of seeing children as immature, that they need to learn something from us, and being able to see them as little people, whole and complete in their own way. And in the spiritual partnership that you can have with these little people, they will awaken you. They will awaken you, for example, of your own unconsciousness, our own reactivity. Am I dealing with my child in an aware manner, or am I being triggered? Too often, we are being triggered when children don't follow our instructions and live up to how we would like to see them live life. We become triggered. And the irony, though, is that, as Osho says, let us assume that your child is making a lot of mistakes along the way. If you allow him the freedom to make those mistakes, obviously not the kinds of mistakes that will hurt him permanently or injure him physically or something like that. But if you allow children their freedom, they can make their own mistakes. The level of fulfillment that they will have from having lived their life and made their mistakes is much greater than any happiness that they can get from having lived an error-free life because they followed all your advice. We want our children to take our advice so badly, and we forget that if they were to make their own mistakes, they will feel so grateful for the freedom and for the respect of autonomy that you gave them. And they will have a sense of fulfillment because they made their own mistakes and they lived their own life. So when children are not following our plan, it is best to remind ourselves that they were never meant to follow our plan. They were never meant to follow our plan. I remember a turning point in my relationship with my son when he was growing up, the eighth grade, ninth grade times. And there was a time where he was being extremely defiant and doing the very opposite of what I was asking him to do. All of a sudden, I remembered one of Osho's discourses where Osho was reminding us that when our children are defying us, are being defiant, it's an occasion for celebration, because that is when the child is showing that he or she is growing in their own direction. Would I want my son to be a carbon copy of me? No, I would love for my son to make his own mistakes, to live his own life fully. And it is that celebration. So I started dancing in the living room when my son started disobeying me. And he started doing, every time he disobeyed me, I would break into a dance. And he was puzzled. He said, "What are you doing? What are you celebrating?" I said, "I am celebrating the fact that you are becoming a human being in your own right, that you're not going to be a carbon copy of your father, that you will be writing your own verse of poetry, that you will be singing your own song and playing your own music." And it was an opportunity for immense celebration. From that day onward, there was a fundamental redefinition of our relationship, because otherwise, too much of our childhood is spent resisting and avoiding the domination and control that our parents seek to exercise. And when our whole childhood becomes a story of avoiding the domination of others, we tend to carry that, and we tend to have these patterns of resistance and counterdependence that follow us everywhere. So, another thing to be aware of in the context of compassionate parenting is the importance of having a conversation, standing on the same side of the fence versus the opposite side of the fence. This is a distinction that Osho has elaborated upon in his book of secrets, and I loved it. Many of us, think of conversations you've had. Sometimes somebody is talking to you and you feel that they're on the same side of the fence as you are, or on the same side of the tennis court as you are. They're your partner. Sometimes people are talking to you where you feel they're on the opposite side of the fence. They're coming at you, trying to get you to change your mind, to think differently, to manipulate you, to teach you something, to change you in some way. It's on the opposite side of the fence. It's very subtle. And we know when somebody is on the same side of the fence versus somebody on the same opposite side of the fence. I believe that one of the greatest gifts we can give our children is just the gift of feeling understood, especially in this VUCA world where things are so chaotic with the pandemic. There is social isolation. The world has turned upside down. Children are dying to feel understood. It is just amazing. Now, it's not that you have to accept how they see the situation, but you have to take the time to understand. When another human being steps into your shoes and sees the world through your eyes, it is an amazing therapeutic moment. It's a moment of healing. That feeling of being understood. And notice how, even as grown-ups, there are such few relationships we have where people are willing to accept us unconditionally and just to hear us through and know what it's like. Usually, the moment we share something, somebody is trying to fix us, somebody is trying to help us, perhaps with a positive intention. But there is something that Carl Rogers, the non-directed therapist, called unconditional positive regard. Just listening, a profound listening with no intent even to make anything better, to change anything, to influence anything. So standing on the same side of the fence, listening to your children's experience, it's amazing how much of pain is lifted just when one other human being in the world is willing to listen to you. Another distinction I want to leave you with is what Osho talks about as the language of love versus the language of logic. Too much of our time in the world, in the business world, is the language of logic. You're required to be logical about everything and to prove everything. And we bring those habits and tendencies. Home is a place where you have to drop from the head to the heart, where you make that leap from the language of logic to the language of love. Notice when somebody is speaking to you in the language of love, there is a softness, there is a tenderness. There's not an analysis, but there is a willingness to listen. There is a kind acceptance. There is a deep compassion. The language of love carries with it that kind of softness and compassion, and it's amazingly therapeutic. And just these two distinctions can transform any relationship. Standing on the same side of the fence, not on the opposite side of this fence, speaking to the other in a language of love rather than in a language of logic. I want to conclude this webinar. Obviously, I probably presented a tenth of what I had intended to present, but that's the way it is, time flies. I want to read out Khalil Gibran's famous work on children, from the Prophet. Many of us have read Khalil Gibran's book. It is just a friendly reminder of how important it is to hold the space. Says Khalil Gibran, your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. How beautiful. Your children have come through you. You don't possess them. They don't belong to you. You may give them your love, but not your thoughts, for they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls. How beautiful. Give their bodies a home. That don't imagine that you're going to house their souls. For their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow. For their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. How true. Your children's souls dwell in the house of tomorrow that you will not even be able to visit, even in your dreams. You may strive to be like them, but seek not to make them like you. How beautiful. Don't try to make your children be like you. It's okay if you want to strive to be like them, but don't try to make them be like you. For life goes not backward, nor tarries with yesterday. And then he goes on to say this next paragraph, which is so beautiful. You are the bow from which your children as living arrows are sent forth. The archer sees the mark upon the path of the infinite, and he bends you with his might, that his arrows may go swift and far. So you release the arrow. Your children are the arrows that you're releasing. Let those arrows go swift and far. Let your bending in the archer's hand be for gladness. For even as he loves the arrow, the he with the capital H, for even as he loves the arrow that flies, so he also loves the bow that is stable. So to really be able to see in the metaphor of the bow and the arrow is the child, and the bow is that place of stability from which we have given a launching pad for our children to embark upon their future. So I want to conclude the first part of this webinar. This is where we conclude the seminar for webinar. For those who want to leave, you're free to leave. But I know that in the past, we've had a few of our sojourners here linger on for a few minutes to be able to participate in a little bit of a discussion, to contribute their stories and their insights, because as you know, this is such a vast topic. We have just scaled the surface, and talking about the role of unconditional acceptance in loving ourselves unconditionally, in forgiving ourselves unconditionally, so that we may bring that space of love and unconditional acceptance to the children and to the lives of people we touch. So at this point, if you would like to hop off the webinar, you're welcome to do that. If you'd like to stay for the extra time to participate in a conversation, you're most welcome. And at any time in that conversation you want to leave, you're welcome to leave. So thank you so much. I'm profusely grateful to you. Once again, the books that I would recommend, The Book of Children by Osho, a very deep sensitivity to the inner life of children. The Conscious Parent by Shefali Sabari, a book recommended by Oprah. And of course, always I would say Intimacy. If you have not bought and read Osho Intimacy, I would say that it helps you in your relationships, but it also helps you in parenting. It is where you work through the fundamental conundrums of your relationship with yourself. Intimacy by Osho, O-S-H-O. Thank you, folks. You may unmute yourself. I think I'm set up to have you unmute yourself. If not, I'm going to fumble around with the adjustments till I can do that. Would somebody try to unmute themselves and see if they're set up to do that and say something?
Yes, yeah, Param, I did it and it works.
Excellent. Yeah. I'm so happy and I'm so grateful. And also I noticed there are chat comments, so it's an opportunity for us to scroll through those as we deal with any discussion issues or points that come up. Thank you so much. Over to you all. Anybody have a comment, a question, an observation? We're here for it.
Comments for the grandparents. Sorry, this is Biman.
Yes, Biman.
Yeah, I know I have to grow with my grandkid as well, but any specific adjustments that I need to do with my grandkid as well as my own kid who are their parents, that so that they are not imposing on them and they love them but not own them.
Beautiful. I don't know that I can give advice, but I would say I want to go back to emphasizing the book Conscious Parent. The reason I emphasize it is because there are a number of books written by psychologists which approach the topic very differently. What Shefali Sabari has done in this book, it's a very easy to read book, The Conscious Parent, is she's really combining parenting with Eastern traditions of spirituality like Sufism and Zen and Taoism, very gentle traditions where you actually see the child as the ocean of wisdom, as the ocean of innocence, and the entire parenting relationship as a spiritual journey that you undertake. I would say that book has many practical examples of how you could respond differently, you know, from a space of wisdom rather than a space of psychologizing, you know. So I would strongly recommend The Conscious Parent. It's a very beautiful book and a very easy read. But in most matters, I go back to the same principle that the best way to alter this transgenerational flow of patterns that is happening in our lives is to heal ourselves. And when we heal ourselves, automatically there's a very sudden shift in our relationship with our children, which then transmits to a shift in our relationship with our grandchildren. So often people have advice based on how-tos. Mine is more of appreciating a being-based approach, that when we come to accept and love ourselves for who we are, there is a cascading effect, a downstream effect that happens where everything falls in place. So I would say, Biman, I know you to be a meditative person, meditation, mindfulness, and, you know, dropping from the mind to the heart and approaching relationships from that place creates a context, you know, in which everything changes. Sorry, I couldn't be
Thank
more
you very
helpful
much,
to
as
you than that.
always.
It was a very general kind of an answer. Anyone
Thank you.
else have a comment or thought? Or a story to share in terms of how you were parented?
Hi, Param, this is Sumi.
Hello, Sumi.
I just wanted to say, because, you know, I don't have any children, never had, never married. So, you know, that part is off. But I realized going back to my, the way my parents brought me up, a lot of freedom to do what we want. And for instance, if I want to touch something like a stove, a pot is boiling, I'm trying to touch it. My mother would say, no, don't do that. I would say, why? You know, you'll get burnt. Oh, okay. Otherwise, sometimes they'll say, you'll know, you know, sometimes you live and learn. You have to learn yourself. You know, we can't be teaching you everything. And by the same token, for my brothers, if, or me, for instance, I come home and grumble, you know, so-and-so, my classmate said such and such, or did such and such. And they'll say, okay, you were there on the spot, so you know all the facts. No matter how you tell us, we won't know all the facts. So it's for you to go take care of it. And for my brothers, if they get into a tussle, which they never did, but in case, my parents will say, if you come home with a broken fist or something, I'll take you to the hospital, but it's still your fight. I'm supporting you as a parent, you know, in your health, but not to the point of interfering, because their ideology was children afterwards get together, you know, their friendship again, you know, back to normal. Whereas once parents get involved, it's end of story. You know, then it is entity forever kind of thing. So that's why when I, you know, my students, I tell them, you know, think for yourself. It's like, you know, you tell us what to do, teacher. I don't like that idea.
Right, right. And unfortunately, that is the way, you know, many people have been parented, and they tend to carry those expectations. What you're saying, I love your story because it shows the double binds of parenting. So often parents want you to make the right choices, but they don't want to give you the freedom to make a lot of mistakes. Now, as we all know, How is it possible to come to the right door unless you've opened 100 wrong doors, as Osho says? So that's one of the challenges. Mistakes and from following one's own voice is very important. I want to talk about another double bind that we get into. We often want children to tell the truth, and we punish children for telling the truth. That's the irony of it. We say, I want to know the truth. And when the child tells you what really happened, you punish them for it. Now, understand what's happening. If we are punishing our children for telling the truth, what are we telling them? Obviously, we are telling them it doesn't make sense to tell the truth. You might as well put all your energies into being a skillful and creative liar. So it is so important to remember that when truth, it is the responsibility to create an honest relationship where people feel safe is equally upon the parent and the child. So and more upon the parent, I would say, that if we punish children for telling the truth and we say they should always tell the truth, well, I don't see how that's going to work out. So it's one of the double binds in which we place our own children. There's a gentleman here from something called Dialogic Consulting. He had his camera on and he has turned it off. I didn't know if you wanted to say something, sir. If feel free.
Yeah. So sorry, my name is sort of linked to the account, and I keep forgetting to change it.
That's no
my
problem.
name is Ajay.
Ajay?
Yeah. So actually, I did.
Welcome
find
to the
that
webinar, Ajay.
Thank you very much. I'm an old participant here. I mean, by age, not by frequency.
I understand.
Sorry. So and I'm also having my lunch. So
very visibly, as we can see.
Some odd sounds, yeah.
Yeah.
So the thing I did want to share was a couple of things. One is, for me, once I do know that I've already created, like I know that for a certain period in my elder son's life, I wasn't the kind of parent I wanted to be, because I was parenting for myself. I was parenting for my short-term well-being of not having to deal with my son's misbehavior, rather than looking at what is it that he needs to learn and grow. And the other thing for me was, so I have, let's say, 4 years of, and I don't believe it, but just for the sake of conversation, I had 4 years of terrible, being not a good father to my son.
Sure.
And I do believe it created some distortions for him. There were two things in this. One is, for me, the fact that I was actually creating distortions in my son actually came from my recognizing what it felt like to be on the other side of that behavior from my father. So for me, I was actually grateful for, as opposed to saying, oh, my father made me like this, I'm so glad that I could experience him that way, because it gave me a chance to be something else and something different. So there was gratitude towards my parents. The second thing is, once I've already, done the distortions, created the distortions in my kids that I didn't want to do because of my lack of awareness, I have experienced a tendency to feel guilty. And I feel that is also not necessary, because I've framed it as the crap I've handed over to my kids are actually my gifts to them for them to grow in life.
Yes.
So that's kind of just what I wanted to share. And that, the double bind, or there is a mirror to be experienced with your own parents as there is with your kids, if you have the fortune or misfortune of having both. Obviously, you can't have not had parents, but yeah.
Very beautiful. Thank you for those very profound comments, Ajay. I appreciate it. Thank you. Very grateful to you.
As Minister